Hi, everyone. Welcome to our series of interviews where we dive into critical topics of data ethics and equity in research and clinical care. So, I'm Yuki Kotani from the Child Mind Institute, where I lead strategic partnerships for our science team. And so, at the Child Mind Institute, we believe in the power of ecological data. So, the real world data that comes from the interactions between people and technology to enhance research and clinical care. And so this series of interviews aims to explore how we can ethically and equitably use this data to benefit all patient populations. And today I'm excited to be speaking with Christa Studzinksi, the Director of Partnerships at the Ontario Brain Institute. Christa has extensive experience in fostering collaborations and maximizing the impact of neuroscience research. So today we'll be discussing the importance of ecological data, the ethical and equity challenges in using it, especially as it pertains to youth mental health, and how the Ontario Brain Institute approaches these issues. So let's get started. Krista, thank you so much for joining me today. Could you begin by sharing a bit about your role and the work you do at the Ontario Brain Institute?
Yeah, absolutely, Yuki. Thank you for having me. Super excited to be here today. So, the Ontario Brain Institute is a not for profit that's been around for about 13 years. And our whole reason for existence and the reason for our creation was about getting the really amazing work that's happening in academia out into the community where people are living with and receiving care for their brain disorders. And so we do it a bunch of different ways. And it's really about where can we strategically kind of put some investments and some efforts to make sure that those things are moving out of the lab and into life. And so we have our strategic research programs that bring together researchers, clinicians, industry partners, and patient advocacy groups. And these really focus on that sort of standardized assessment, trying to look at how do we subgroup populations of individuals who look more the same, so that we're more likely to find interventions or treatments or what have you that might actually be able to help them. Um, our team is the business development and partnerships team, and so we work very closely with neurotechnology companies. So early stage startup companies, we're trying to get them to their first big check. And the work that we do really focuses on working with companies that want to do the hard work of validation. And what that looks like comes in many different shapes and sizes, but validation with clinicians, researchers, and most recently, the work that we've really doubled down on is doing validation in the community, in the real world with end users, so they can give us their very important perspective of how these technologies work. You can have the most valid digital technology in the world, but if end users don't like it or don't want to use it, then it really doesn't matter. And so and I should say, and I always leave this for last, but it actually is the most important piece of the work that we do. Patients and people with lived experience really are at the center of everything that we do. So they're informing our research priorities. They're helping us develop policies and guidelines and helping making those guidelines understandable for people so they can advocate for the care that they need. And then most recently, again, helping us test these technologies.
Yeah, no, that's really fantastic and really impactful work. So you just mentioned three things, right? So there's the standardized assessment piece, so to help identify subgroups, working and partnering with neurotech, up and coming neurotech companies to do validation work, and then really bringing in research participants, bringing in people's lived experience into the validation process. So I'd love to kind of dive sort of first into the standardized assessment piece. How are you actually doing these standardized assessments in clinical or research settings? And then how has that sort of directly impacted the treatment approaches or the patient outcomes that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think the best example I can give of this is our research program called PON, the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopmental Disorders. So it's a program led by Dr. Evdokia Ignastu, which focuses on children with autism, ADHD, OCD, intellectual disability, plus, plus, plus. And so the concept here is, all of these kids are so different, and yet the diagnostic label that they receive doesn't always translate into making similar symptoms. And so, how do we then administer standardized assessments across the board so that we can start looking at understanding that biology in a better way so that hopefully we can actually find subgroups of patients that look more the same. And the example I always give relates to, if you're looking at a drug that increases GABA in the brain and you're taking all comers and you actually have a bunch of kids who have too much GABA and some kids that don't have enough GABA, you're kind of washing out the potential beneficial effect of the treatment. This is probably way oversimplified, but it kind of gets the concept across that you really need to start to understand, who looks more the same. And let's target those treatments and let's kind of move that personalized medicine approach a little bit further along so that we can actually help improve outcomes.
So are you seeing, so that's super interesting, are you seeing now sort of an emergence of technology or startups and technology that are focused on these subgroups based on these standardized assessments, or is it currently more sort of a homogeneous sort of like approach to developing technology and collecting the data?
I mean, we're seeing a lot of different types of technologies. I think the ones that are kind of especially front of mind right now are the technologies that can help us sort of understand what these people are experiencing in their homes and in their communities, because the episodic interfaces with the clinician or with the researcher doesn't always represent what's going on in their day-to-day lives. And so having some of these technologies that can assess or can help the individual keep track of their day-to-day can actually maybe give us some more interesting insights. And I'll take it a step further to say it's probably also not going to just be one modality that gives us this amazing insight, but rather it's going to be a combination of different types of modalities of data that we're looking at.
Yeah, no, here at Child Mind Institute, I mean, that's one of the big things, right? It's all these multimodal uh, data collection that we're doing is trying to see the relationship between these different types of data, whether it's EEG, wearables, passive sensors, and surveys assessment, and bringing that together to see the sort of the holistic picture of that patient, and how to move forward. So sort of just kind of moving forward in terms of the startup. So how are you working with these startup companies, especially in neurotech, helping them through the validation, getting their first big check? Can you give us some examples of how some of these partnerships work and the impact they've had?
Yeah, so we have an early stage program called NERV. Neuroscientists should never be allowed to do marketing. And it's really giving $100,000 and mentorship and helping them get to that sort of first, the MVP kind of stage of their product and do some early validation work. And that actually helps them tap into the ecosystem here in Canada, where there are other granting programs that can kind of follow on from that. We have another program that is more investment focused, and it's really about what we were seeing in Canada was that companies were starting to talk to potential investors, and the investors were interested, but like the companies were still a little bit too early. And so, what we could do at OBI is we can actually help pay for some of those product development milestones or key validation milestones that are going to help that investor make a go no go decision. And from a drug side, we've actually seen some of our companies sign some pretty great deals with some large multinational pharma companies. I'm trying to think of some other really great examples, where we did some investment and the company was able to get reimbursement through a government program here in Canada. And then the newest program on the block is the one that I've really been leading over the last couple of years and piloting, and we call it Cortex. Again, really great, brain-related names. But this is one where we're partnering the neurotech companies with our community groups and our patient advocacy groups. And this really came about because all of our companies, a lot of times we would see they'd have a personal story related to the disease or the disorder, and that's what prompted them to start their company. And they're really invested in making sure that they're improving lives. And oftentimes we're finding it difficult to find those pilot sites that could help them test it in the real world. And at the same time, we've spent 12 years building trust with our patient advocacy groups and really doing some innovative things in terms of how we're shaping research questions and those sorts of things. And so we approached them and said, hey, like we have all this technology here, and who better to test it than you guys, right? Like you understand your condition, what your daily lives are like. So how about if you come with us and help us test it? And we'll provide some funding to the community partner to help us do that. And we'll collect some sort of clinically relevant scale. So it's never going to be like, the 3 hour neuropsych assessment that a neuropsychologist might do. But what's that scale that we can do that gives a clinician enough of a signal to say, hey, you know what, this wearable, whatever it is, actually is telling me something really important about what that person is experiencing, and could maybe trigger, maybe I should do this extra assessment when they come in for their visit, or maybe they're okay for another 6 months and we don't need to, spend neurologist time or in the US and money, to pay for that visit. And so that's really the idea behind Cortex.
Yeah, and I mean that's amazing too, right? I think so. So I have some background experience building products, and here at CMI, also, we're building a number of products, and that's right. Oftentimes, the biggest thing is how do you bring the product to market? How do you build it in such a way that you also are getting buy-in from the clinicians? They're getting the data that they need, that the patients are, there's actual impact on the patients. And then there's also like that research impact that is actually moving science forward. And so that's amazing that you're able to sort of pull all of these, I think in some ways disparate groups together with a sort of a shared mission.
Yeah, and
Oh, go
Yuki,
ahead.
I'm going to add the part that I really love about this program. I can't believe I didn't say this before, but we're working in a lot of these instances, we're working in more rural and remote areas. So areas where people don't necessarily have traditional access to healthcare, and don't always have that neurologist just down the street, right? And so part of the deployment of this technology is looking at, okay, how can we maybe use these things to create alternate care pathways for meeting people where they are and helping them access the care that they need, how they want.
Yeah, and that's so important. That's one of the things that here at John Mind Institute we talk about often is, right, there's not enough, there's a workforce shortage. And so how do we deploy the technology? How do we build the technology to sort of like fill these gaps? And so in rural areas or, underprivileged areas where they might not have access. And so technology is really, really the only solution right now to really scale that impact. So that's amazing. So kind of double clicking into the sort of the validation process, how do you sort of ensure that the validation process meets sort of the real world applications, and what sort of data do you look at? Because I think, oftentimes like what the data researchers want versus what investors want, what versus what clinicians want are not the same, right? So what's that Venn diagram look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'd like to think that because of the privileged position that we're in, where we work with a lot of these different stakeholders, we can have those conversations and say, okay, well, what would be interesting to you? And kind of have that conversation around, okay, well, a 3 hour neuropsych assessment is not going to be practical in, a rural community, but what's the other thing that we can look at? And have that dialogue, and going to the regulators to say, hey, when you do your health economic modeling, what are some of the things, that the key pieces that you really want to see come out of that? And then of course from the investor side as well, having them, it's a conversation, and it's the way that we frame OBI's role oftentimes is kind of that unbiased third party validator, right? So we can take all of the interests from all the different groups, and we'll kind of come up with something that meets, it's not going to be perfect, but we'll
Mhm.
help you answer the questions that you really need before doubling down.
Yeah. And so to that, how do you actually then bring in user feedback? How do you actually incorporate that into the development of these products? And I mean, I'm sure there's challenges associated with it.
Yeah. So, I think again, it goes back to the relationship that we've been able to build, right? And so there's a certain amount of trust that's been there. There's a lot of trust, and we protect that very carefully because, as I'm sure trust takes forever to build, and you can lose it in an instant. And so having those active conversations with the participants and with the community groups that are testing the tech for us, we have certain strategies in place that can help de-risk. So for example, the data that's collected through the tech and the data that's collected by the community partner, they come together in a almost like a safe space. We have an informatics platform called BrainCode that helps match that data up. So we're minimizing the risk of, companies getting data and using it in inappropriate ways. We have the conversations with the community groups to say, hey, what's important? What's important to your clients? Before we even start talking about testing technology, like what are the things that they might actually be interested in using technology for, right? So we're doing
Yeah.
something in a dementia population right now, and it's digital cognitive assessments. We were that because that's something that everybody's looking for right now. So let's see if this technology can fill the gap. Let's not try to force a technology on someone for something that they don't even really care about.
Yeah, right. And what's the actual real pain point, right? That they're trying to solve while also moving science forward, helping with clinicians with their workflows. Um, no, definitely
Yeah,
super interesting.
but it's driven by the end users, right? And so
Yep.
the one of the other examples, of something tangible where we've engaged with end users and people with lived experience, and they've actually, given our pond programs some amazing feedback to the point where they've actually changed some of their clinical trial outcome measures because they were things that were identified by the end users to say, this is something that's really interesting to us. And lo and behold, when you do the clinical trial, that thing moves more than the clinical scale that everyone has trouble moving in clinical trials.
Oh wow, that's actually a pretty big like insight, right? Like people don't really think about. Um, I definitely want to explore that, but I do want to just go back to sort of the trust piece that you just mentioned. So I get trust in these sort of like very clearly what you've built is this very authentic engagement with the participants in research. Do you have any sort of lessons learned or recommendations when building this sort of level of trust with research participants, especially younger ones, right?
Yeah,
Youth with mental health and learning challenges.
yeah, absolutely. So it needs to be authentic. Number one, like you are not doing this to check a box. If you're doing it to check a box, it's just going to come across, and you're not going to get that level of engagement then and trust that you're looking for. So you know authentically engage because you genuinely care and you're genuinely open to maybe pivoting or expanding or evolving a little bit. Um, a lot of people are talking about the importance of doing this, but how do you do that? And how do you start to build that capacity? So as an organization, we actually built out, it's like a one pager infographic type thing that talks about the different stages of research and gives examples of how we can actually engage end users throughout the different stages of research. And so, at its simplest, it can be a menu of options, right? Where people can identify this is okay, I can do this, or no, I want to do this. But again, you need the follow through. You need to authentically engage and meaningfully engage with them at those stages, and it helps both sides, the end users and the researchers and clinicians, to understand. Okay, well, here's something that tangible that we can look at together and figure out. And so that was something that was really impactful. I think we had someone on our on staff here develop that like 10 years ago, and it's still I was at an event 2 weeks ago and it came out again where they were saying here's the list, and so starting to build that dialogue and build that relationship between the two groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important, right? At the end of the day, it's just breaking down the silos and and then making sure you get buy-in. I think especially in the healthcare space, a lot of professionals are not necessarily early adopters of technology, so bringing them into the process so that it's actually, you know, seamlessly, enters into their workflow is so important. So you just mentioned the infographic. Is this something that's publicly available
We
or
can
that you guys
definitely make
share?
it. Yep,
Okay.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, I
yeah.
would love if you don't mind sharing that afterwards. We can, include that into the link for this video.
100% more than happy to do that. And I think the other thing I'll say too is, don't worry about being perfect, right? And sometimes you don't want to engage because you're afraid of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And I'll be the first one to admit I say silly things all the time. But what happens is I apologize and I learn from it. And it's a very it's I'm there, and everyone makes mistakes, and you just own them, and you're coming from a good place because the engagement is authentic.
Yes. No, makes a lot of sense. And and then sort of taking it a step further, right? Like one of the takeaways I want people to get is sort of a better understanding of some of the ethical implications around the work that we're doing. and especially right when it comes to the youth, the children and our adolescents. Do you sort of have any sort of recommendations, things that we need to be considering from an ethical standpoint when collecting data, when doing these sort of validation work and sort of this research, participatory research?
Yeah, I think, talk to them about it. Ask them what they feel comfortable with, and, make sure that that's part of your ethics application, because that'll give you a, like, when the ethics board comes back to you and asks questions, you can say, well, we actually we checked and this was something that they felt was really important, and so we want to do it because it's important to them. um, you know uh, that to me is like the most important piece of all of this, right? Is just doing it with them, and don't make assumptions. We're talking a lot about tech, and there's this messaging that tech is so bad for our kids and it's destroying their mental health, and I'm not denying it. It's genuinely a problem, but tech can also be really great. And how do we use it in a way that is thoughtful and respecting that, right? So, helping kids that don't live in an urban center access some of these supports. That's a good thing for tech to be able to do. And, asking the youth how they want to use tech. Do you feel comfortable with things like passive monitoring? I mean, like, I'll give you a completely different example in our or elderly population. So we were doing this thing with the digital human, and our initial reaction was like, there is no way that our seniors are going to be comfortable speaking to a digital human. And we went and we tested it, and lo and behold, they actually really liked it. And for reasons that we hadn't actually considered coming into the study. And so, don't assume. Talk to them and ask them the questions about what they think. And if they say I don't know, think about how you flip that question on its head. So, when we
Yeah.
first started saying, hey, come test tech with us, what kind of tech do you want to test? There were like blank stares. And I was like, okay, so how do we ask the question differently? Okay, what are some of the things that you're struggling with in your daily life? And you listen and you're like, okay, what about this technology? Because it might actually help you with this other thing that you're struggling with.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting, and I think too, right? Like there's so many like generational changes, and I hear us Child Mind Institute, you know, our belief is like, look, we're in a digital world. Like this is what like digital is here to stay. The internet is here to stay. So how do we best empower the children and the parents to navigate this world? Um, and then right, and then asking those pointed questions of like, okay, well, how can we think about the positive ways of using technology. And there's actually a really funny sort of anecdote, like sort of the generational change. We were testing something and the particular feature, but then the feedback what we got was that the instruction was too millennial. And they were like, and that literally threw them off. And so that was just like an interesting sort of like eye-opening experience, I think, for all of us to be like, oh wow, like we have to change our paradigm and to really think about who the end users are versus putting our own assumptions um,
Absolutely.
onto the
What's
product.
normal
Yeah.
and everyday to them is like, in a lot of ways, not stuff that we grew up with. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Hmm.
So we need to make sure that we're using the right frame when we're talking about some of these things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I feel like I can talk to you forever. I have so many questions, but I know we're almost at time. Is there anything that you sort of want to make sure the audience sort of understands about the work that you guys do at Ontario Brain Institute, about sort of participatory research, especially as it pertains to the youth and mental health?
So, I mean, happy to chat with anybody about the work that the Ontario Brain Institute does. I mean, for me, it's actually very personal and aligns closely with my core values. So I could talk for hours about OBI. But the message I think I want to leave everyone with today is the participatory research is so important. It's just it can't be an afterthought, and you need to be doing it. You should be doing it, and it's just going to transform the outputs of your research to make them really truly meaningful and impactful. And it's worth going down that journey.
Yeah, 100%. I think everyone needs to start to think about how to best do it, right? At the end of the day, we want everyone has every good intention of creating products, and we want it to be impactful, but for there to actually be have longevity with any of these products, and to add to like the more positive narrative around digital solutions I think is so important. So, Krista, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And I'm definitely going to be reaching out to you. I have a lot more questions, and I'd love to continue this conversation at a later time. So, thank you so much.
Amazing, Yuki. Thank you so much for having me today. It was a pleasure. I look forward to many more conversations and all the best.
Thank you.